Hello everyone, and I hope you're keeping safe. Now for this week's edition of House Histories, as it's the VE Day bank holiday coming up this Friday, I thought that I would deliver this rather short talk for you all today on D-Day. I was asked to write it as an after dinner talk for the Prince William of Gloucester barracks in Grantham, and so it's D-Day, the day of destiny. Now by June 1944, Germany had already effectively lost the war. After its failure at Kursk, Germany was in a worse position than it found itself in November 1918, when it had a more sensible and sane government and had surrendered. Its losses in the east and in Africa had been severe. Its air force had been devastated in the skies over Germany, and its cities were being bombed flat. Now Hitler hoped that he could drive the British and American landings into the sea and then withdraw these forces from Western Europe and concentrate his army against the Russians in an attempt to deliver a decisive defeat on the Russian army in the Eastern Front. Now even if the German army did succeed in driving the British and Americans into the sea, and he had withdrawn these forces and sent them off to fight the Russians, then it would have made little difference. The German army could no longer halt the Red Army. But despite that, D-Day was still vital to free Europe. But it was vital to free Europe, not to liberate it from the Germans, but ultimately to keep Europe free from the Russians. Had D-Day failed, a new assault would have had to have waited until 1945, and the Cold War border would likely have been the River Rhine and the Alps. Everything to the east of that would have been under Soviet control. But the British were reluctant, it has to be said, to launch D-Day. Now, our Prime Minister, Churchill, was haunted by the failure of Gallipoli, which of course he had been personally associated with. And both he and Brooke, the head of the army, had been also psychologically scarred by the losses of the Anzio landings. In Sicily and Salerno, landings had soon descended into chaos. Now, in January 1944, an Anglo-American corps was landed at Anzio, but they managed to secure only a narrow perimeter, which was repeatedly and furiously assaulted by the Germans. I have here the words of a Scottish infantry officer. And so we go back to the First World War. Oozing thick mud, tank hulks, the cold, God the cold, graves marked by a helmet, gashed by shrapnel, with stretches of barbed wire. In February, the Germans tried to drive these landings in Italy around Anzio into the sea. I have here the words of an Irish Guards corporal. I never saw so many people killed around me before in my life. Some Allied units broke and ran towards the sea. After a 4-month siege, General Alexander ordered them to break out on the 23rd of May. On the 4th of June, Rome fell to the British and American forces, but the German army escaped due to the incompetent decisions of the American General Clark, who had been involved in the breakout. The point was not to capture Rome. Rome's a lovely city, but militarily it had no great value. The point of the Anzio landings was to capture the German army in Italy, surround it, encircle it, destroy it. Instead, General Clark wanted to grab the glory of being the one to march into Rome, and so he allowed the German army to escape north to new defensive lines so that he could parade through Rome. It would be a terrible mistake, militarily speaking, and allowed the German army to fall back to what they called the Gustav Line. And so, hitherto in the war, major amphibious landings had been disappointing failures. The British generals also were reluctant to fight a major battle in France, and instead would have rather have launched a series of much smaller landings across the Mediterranean, from southern France, across Italy, the Yugoslav coast and in Greece to try and bite away at the German Empire. British air chiefs were also reluctant to support the D-Day landings. They didn't want to halt the strategic bombing campaign that was steadily winning the war. Indeed, it was one of our big contributions to the victory in the Second World War was the bombing of German cities. It's unpleasant, it involves the killing of a lot of women and children, but the German Air Force had been pulled away from the Russian front to fight the British and American bombing campaigns, which had deprived them of the critical air superiority over the Eastern Front, and the bombings had done huge damage to German industrial output and to German morale. Now, people have pointed out that as the war went on, German industrial output increased despite the bombing, and that is certainly true. But you've got to ask yourself how much more it could have increased had we not been bombing their factories in this way. But despite the reluctance of both the British General Staff and the Air Marshals to launch D-Day, still it was determined, particularly by the Americans, who were very keen on a landing in France, that D-Day would go ahead. But despite the fact that the British were reluctant and the Americans keen, it would be British officers who would take the lead in the landings. And so Montgomery, the great British Field Marshal, would be in charge of American and British ground forces. Ramsay would be in charge of the fleet, and Lee Mallory would be in charge of the air forces. And so although the Supreme Command was American, the commanders of all the individual components, be they ground, sea or air, they were all British commanders due to their vast experience of fighting the German army. Now, it has to be said that also many of the British soldiers who had been chosen for D-Day were highly reluctant to hit those beaches. These formations were veterans of the North Africa and Italian campaigns, and many of them resented being chosen yet again. Now, militarily it made sense. After we'd lost a lot of our military equipment in 1930 at Dunkirk, a lot of British units hadn't actually seen action, but some units had been in constant action throughout the Second World War. And so the 51st Highland Division was one of those units that was chosen to hit the beaches of D-Day. Now, they had had a tough war. They had been part of the rear guard at Dunkirk. They had then been hastily rearmed, and they'd been sent off to fight in North Africa and in Italy, and then they were withdrawn from Italy and told that they were going to hit the beaches of France, which is why you might be able to sympathise with the words of one officer from the 51st Highland Division when he was told that his unit was going to be hitting the beaches. He responded with, "Who else is fighting this bloody war?" And so they're going to go in again. Another regiment that had been in almost constant action was the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment. Now, they nearly mutinied when they were told that they were going to be the ones hitting those beaches, and wrote on their barrack walls, "No second front." Despite the fact, of course, there already was a second front in Italy, but they were determined that they weren't going to go. They'd had enough, and they felt that some of these units that had spent the war, well, effectively dossing around in Britain waiting to be equipped, maybe they could go. Now, you might say, yeah, that sounds fair, but this is going to be a tough battle, a really tough battle. Trained troops and experienced troops will be critical. And of course, the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, the 51st Highland Division, they know what they're doing. A lot of these units that haven't seen much action in Britain, they're not the right men to send to the beaches of France, because they lack this crucial combat experience. But you can understand why these men are reluctant. The 3rd Royal Tank Regiments are ultimately only talked around by their highly popular command officer who convinces them that he will go with them every step of the way, and so they agree that they will support him.